we are structuring this as a roundtable, and there are two main guiding cluster of questions. So I'm going to read the first one, and we'll start there. So how did each of us come to Latinx feminist theory and philosophy? And can each of us share what we identify as some of the main issues, defining traits, and questions that we think are particularly significant to Latinx feminist philosophy and theory? And I'm going to start with Mariana.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Cynthia. First of all, let me thank Anthony for organizing this event. And I thank you, Andrea and Cynthia, for being here. It is really an honor to be in conversation with you about a topic that is very close to my heart. And also that I think is very important. Latina feminist theory and philosophy is very important. And I think it's already changing the philosophical terrain. And so I look forward to hear what your views are in terms of what's happening in the field, but also what's coming in the future. Before I tell you about my own discovery of Latina feminism, which radically changed my philosophical thinking, I must stress that here I wish to talk about Latina feminist theories and philosophies in the plural. We must avoid a common mistake that is made in discussion of work that engages different, hitherto marginalized topics in philosophy, that they are homogeneous, or provide an essential voice regarding the group being discussed. Latina feminist theory and philosophy stands as a multi-voice, multiplicitous field in which its practitioners are inspired by different ontological, epistemic, metaphysical, and relational commitments. It is also a deeply interdisciplinary field that allows for philosophical thinking to emerge from personal narratives, poems, myths, literary works, as well as more traditional theoretical and philosophical writing. In this sense, it can be both enriching as well as disorienting for philosophers. That is, it can move us in directions that we were not expecting. That was the case for me. I came to Latina feminist theory late in my career after I had finished my degree in Continental Philosophy, specifically Heideggerian Phenomenology, with an emphasis on questions of self and subjectivity. Given my interest in the importance of lived experience, I was deeply, deeply struck by Maria Lugones's 1987 essay, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. I should tell you that in my philosophical education, I never read a work on Latina philosophy or Latina feminist theory. And so I had to teach it to myself along with my students who were interested in the topic. What was utterly moving for me was not the style of writing, that was not only the style of writing, which was personal and very willing to take risks, but also the description of the experience of the self-confusion, what Maria Lugones calls an ontological confusion of a multicultural, what we may call multicultural or a migrant self. How one can consider oneself playful. This is the example that Maria Lugones gives. How one can consider oneself playful in a familiar world, but also as unplayful in the new world to which one has traveled to, and due to a shift in one's life, whether it's a migration, whether it's exile, whether it is just the fact that you live in between communities, that you have you inhabit multiple cultural milieus. The description of this confused self was the description of my own migrant exilic self. And it captured the nuances of what I later came to call multiplicital subjectivity. Thus, in my estimation, one of the major contributions of Latina feminist philosophy is precisely the capturing of the lived experience of a subjectivity that, as Norma Alarcón explains, is a subject in process. And she has an essay, a very important essay, a 1996 essay, I believe, where she talks about this idea of Latina feminists and Latina writers theorizing this kind of subjectivity, which she called the subject in process. Well, there have been critiques of a Cartesian subjectivity or a transcendental subjectivity or any kind of subjectivity that posits a unification of self. It seemed to me that Lugones's account, sorry, my dogs, that Lugones's account capture the nuances that would help me, at least as a phenomenologist, revise even phenomenological views that claim to do justice to experience. And so for me, this body of work was very, very important to revise views that were already critical of views of subjectivities in philosophy. Now, since I only have a short time, and Andrea and Cynthia will point out different characteristics of Latina philosophy, I just want to add another one. The commitment to racial and gender justice and other justices, that is, Latina feminist theories and philosophies, were born out of political struggles that call for justice for racial groups in the US. As such, they remain an important locus for the elaboration of critical engagements with hegemonic norms and views that inform multiple aspects of our everyday experience. As such, they constitute critical resources for development of anti-colonial practices. They are openings for critical praxis of justice. And so I look forward to hearing what you think some of the major features of this body of work are. Thank you.
Andrea, do you want to continue?
Sure, yeah. Let me thank you. Let me echo the thanks that Mariana just offered to Anthony, also for inviting us on this in this roundtable, because these are some of the most important thinkers in my life in terms of the people who have, so Cynthia and Mariana being people who have really shaped me from the ground up in terms of my academic life and certainly my framings of Latinx feminist philosophy. And I'm really excited because actually Cynthia was one of my early, like we were both grad students when we met. And so we both kind of have learned together for many years. And Mariana, who I'm going to tell a story about in just a moment, is actually, I mean, you are central to my thinking within Latinx feminist philosophy. So thank you to Anthony for bringing us together, and thank you for everyone for coming to this conversation. I'm excited to have it with these lovely folks. So I think, I mean, I came as to somebody who was not planning on college or academia or anything like that. So I applied to one college. I got into that college, and I thought that grad school was the next grade. And so I didn't have a whole plan of being a scholar or being an academic, but I'm grateful for the things that I've learned and the way that I've come to this. But I think for me, when I was thinking about this question about how I came to Latinx feminist philosophy, you know, there's the story, there's my academic story, which I think has to do with, you know, as a queer mixed Central American and Anglo-American person, I spent like all of my life trying to understand what's going on, why I'm coming in, like, as Mariana mentioned, different cultural spaces, different linguistic spaces, different racialized spaces, different class statuses. So, you know, those kinds of things have really were formative in my early life. And then, you know, coming into university and then reading texts that actually offered descriptions for things that I thought could help me make sense of my own life were hugely formative. So I grew up with a father who's a white Southerner with roots in Virginia and West Virginia, and a mother who, a brown mother who's Central American and a migrant from Panama, who she herself grew up in kind of the desegregation era in Miami. And so, you know, I kind of grew up with these different kind of cultural references and different kind of community relations. But so when I started reading authors, like I was first actually introduced to authors like Shri Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua, and I think it was something called like a multicultural history class, which is interesting already as a name, right? That you need a multicultural history class because everything else is not that. But I remember reading both of these two authors in a history context, which was also exciting because we were reading poetry in a history class, which is also interesting. And I think important because, of course, Shri Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua, we're reading from a touchstone anthology called This Bridge Called My Back. And that book had, you know, poetry, essays, artwork, all kinds of like this world opening for me that I thought was really exciting and helping me understand where I was situated in my body and my relationships with others, you know, trying to understand community spaces in ways. I was hungry for that. And so actually it was like Shri Moraga's poem For the Color of My Mother, which was really important to me as somebody both who, again, has a brown mother and a white father. Moraga also has a brown mother and a white father, also identifies as queer. And so that was like, wait a minute, this is huge that somebody is, I can read someone in college who is actually now giving words and descriptions to something that I only was grasping to understand. And so when I actually, you know, as I said, I thought grad school was the next grade, but I was really fortunate that when I knew something about wanting to read more Latinas and more Latin American authors, and I knew that was something that I wanted to fill out in my studies. And so I ended up applying to the University of South Florida that had a really amazing Cuban philosopher there, Ofelia Schuta. And I had been interested in philosophy kind of more generally as at an undergrad level. I liked you know, studies of kind of like social constructionism and questions of ontology, social ontology, and those kind of things. And Ofelia was actually somebody who really kind of early brought in a lot of critical political traditions from Latin American thought that really also expanded my mind. And it was around that time that I think my early years that I met both of these two lovely folks as well, who just, it blew my world up, right? Like going to Mariana. So I came the second year that Mariana hosted it was called then the Latina Feminisms Roundtable. And I was immersed in a world full of other Latinas, you know, many generations. So what I started to see was intergenerational knowledge. So folks who were just starting their graduate studies, people who were in undergrad and who were coming from very different positionalities, not only in terms of study, but also migration status or embodied experiences. And then also later generations of scholars who were coming back and sharing, you know, what their most recent research was. And so like seeing that kind of breadth and world of authors who had been taking up questions within this field was really exciting. And so some of the, I guess for me, one way that I think a main, just to shift now to what I see as maybe a really important main theme was one that I tried to deal with a little bit in the book, my first book, was trying to understand community relationships and maybe moral accountability in the wake of harm and conflict. And I think for me, as somebody who also, and probably like a lot of Latinas and Latinx people who have grown up with a lot of, you know, needing to deal with conflict, harm, you know, the ways that we harm each other and being accountable to that and learning about how we can build and grow, you know, sometimes repair relationships, but also thinking about kind of intergenerational trauma. You know, that I think to me, questions of healing and growth in the wake of trauma is a central theme for me within Latinx feminist philosophy. And I think, you know, I've learned a lot from this tradition in terms of trying to understand, you know, how can we be morally responsive to those who have harmed us, or if we've harmed others, and then what are the kind of ways in which we can appreciate and understand the complexity and difference of one another and our communities with the fact of that harm, with the fact of that trauma. And I think that's something that we can connect to colonial histories, of course, but also very deeply rooted into personal histories that may exist in families or among friends or colleagues and so on. So I think that's something for me that has been a very central theme. Thanks.
Thank you. And so let me just say, I'm going to try to build on what has been said, although there might be, I think there's going to be a lot of resonances and echoes. I came upon Latina feminist philosophy theory by accident. And so I did an undergraduate degree that simply did not and was not able to give me theoretical, philosophical tools to understand my experience, my sense of self, but in many linguistically, geopolitically, economically, and of course, just broadly speaking, culturally. And so I sought to fill a gap, and the best I could do as somebody who had recently come back to the United States from Argentina was I looked for programs in Latin American studies as a way to find that. And so I end up doing a master's in Latin American studies, and that's, even though I was, really thinking that I wanted to know the Latin American, right, like first and foremost because of my background, I found myself discovering, Gloria Anzaldúa and Chicano studies and Latino studies as really speaking to me and my experiences in a much better way, with even more tools that I found in Latin American thought at that time. The Latin American philosophical thought gave me, conceptions of, an awareness of different forms of thinking, different styles of thinking that is, and a different kind of decolonial massive project of change, dealing with a history of colonialism and violence, right? But it was Anzaldúa who seemed one of the most strangest writers and the strangers way of thinking, and she was a mystery, but also spoke directly to me. And in that context, it was somebody, Renato Rosaldo, who was really the person who started forming me in thinking in this way. And so he introduced me to Chicano studies. I did not know about a whole population and a people and a community who were Chicanos in the United States. I was discovering myself as a Latina rather than, transforming myself from a Latin American Argentinian into a Latina identity and sense of self and relationships, right? New history, right? Relationship to immigration, migration, and a community who is seeking better labor conditions, economic stability. So unlike a lot of, history of Argentinians coming to the United States who might have ended primarily in intellectual environments and in the academy, who moved out of because of political, they're escaping political violence in Argentina. The history of my family is one of labor and finding new economic opportunities, labor opportunities, and it's transcontinental, right? So grandparents moving and ancestors, great grandparents moving from Italy to Argentina, from Argentina, parents moving to the United States. My family kind of divided. So with my sister and my mother, we moved back to Argentina, looking for a better, right, way, less exploitation, right? My mother was working in factories and she just didn't like it in the United States. It was kind of too much. And we can talk about that a little bit more if we want. And then me returning to the United States, in many ways looking for better opportunities because of the economic conditions in Argentina. And my father was here, so he was instrumental to me being able to reinsert myself culturally and academically in the United States. Having said that, right, in terms of the discipline of philosophy, there was nothing. That I went into the PhD and then it was a gap again. It was just absence. And so it was the roundtable in Latina feminism, which was crucial to self-teaching, right, continuing what I had learned in my master's and having a community. And so I don't know where or what Latina, Chicana, Latinx philosophy and theory would be without that intervention from Mariana Ortega and then the community that was created from there. So I think that's an important thing to think about from the history of the discipline. I don't know what would have happened without that roundtable. It's a question mark, right? And then, but what I want to really kind of highlight for me is that is important is that Latinx and Chicanx philosophy and theory was really like born from the streets and from struggle, right? And so even though it becomes disciplined or disciplinary later on, the birth of that kind of thinking, that sphere of thinking, comes from the streets and is born out of social movements of struggle. And it's always already national, transnational, and that kind of borderlands that exists because we are, you know, migrants, immigrants, or subjects to colonial paradigms that repeat themselves in the history of Southwest Texas, for example, Puerto Rico, Cuba, right? And so there's a lot of history there where it's not migration and it's not immigration, but it is just cycles of changes that are geopolitical and they're violent and colonial. So anyways, it's born from the streets, right? And it expresses the type of thinking that expresses and contends with the challenges of coalitions. Coalitions among different individuals and social groups that have very specific and differential demands. There are struggles that are coalitional in nature, but the execution of that coalition, right? That coalition building is not something that comes naturally. So it is a form of labor, like thinking what the relationship is among individuals and groups. And contending and undergoing transformation and the need to think about those differences. And so I think, you know, Andres talked about this bridge called My Back, and that is a key moment of articulating the task of thinking difference and building connections despite our, you know, contending with our limits. That, you know, I think it's Shiri Moraga again who articulates in that edited volume, and it's edited by Shiri Moraga and Anzaldúa, right? So Anzaldúa for me is like a thread and a constant here, but it is theorized and introduced as ethics, right? As a form of empathy that is, there's a demand for empathy, and so it is first and foremost, you know, an ethics, a way of discovering how to relate, how to build coalitions, and bring about better justice conditions for all of these groups and individuals. It is like, it's not, coalitions are difficult. We all know this, and we to this day know this, because in the dominant culture, what we have in terms of indoctrination, how we were raised, the theoretical tools that we're given, the ways of intellectualizing our experiences is founded primarily in a kind of individualism and a kind of notion of freedom that is of non-interference, right? And so Chicana and Latina feminist thinking has to overcome that border if it is to build, which it wants to build, coalitions. Because of all of this, right? This is my entrance into, right? This is what speaks to me about Latina and Chicana and Latinx, and always like this is one of those coalitional issues in naming and linguistic building. But my entrance into this is very personal, as an engagement about empathy, about who I am and situating myself, and then, right, the idea, and that I continuously try to practice as best as I can, it's a growing of roots outwards to the public sphere. I think I said most of. One more thing, because my work is on Gloria and Anzaldúa primarily within this tradition, I just want to say, Andrea and Mariana, if you want to have a sense in writing of the coalitional nature and the crisscrossing of disciplines and interlocutors of what constitutes this community of thinking, I mean, their books are amazing at providing that for you. So I just want to very much highlight that there are resources there that embody and exhibit and express the richness of this. But I just want to also say that coming to Deep South Texas and teaching where I am, gave me an entrance point to a history, an experience, a reality, and a community of what it is that Gloria Anzaldúa was speaking about. And then my students giving me tools to think about notions of spirituality, for example, which for me, thinking about spirituality in philosophy was very difficult because it's mostly, right, there wasn't much space to think about that. Relating, you know, spirituality and reason, right? They seem to be antagonistic, and I didn't really know what to do. So that's an example of something that changed as a result of my engagement with students in the Rio Grande Valley that I just wanted to highlight. I owe my students incredible amounts of the knowledge that I have acquired. So I think I'm going to stop there. Do you guys want to add anything, Mariana, Andrea?
I just wanted to add that I think it's really important to think about, and I think this is where Andrea's work too is very important in their latest book, that not only do we have to think about coalitions across difference in terms of Latin American, Latinx peoples, and people from the other ethnic groups in the US, but we also have to think about the coalitions and the difficulties of coalition among ourselves as Latinx people. And I think that that's important for those people interested in the field, that they know. That's why I started with this idea that we're not homogeneous. In fact, there's tremendous heterogeneity. And at least in the US, I cannot, but I suspect that in England too, but at least in the US, there is this tendency to have these fields, Latina feminism, there's only one metaphysics, one epistemological, one way of being. And what's very difficult and yet interesting and rich in Latina feminist philosophy is precisely its heterogeneity. Not only is it the theorization of heterogeneous subjectivities, right, but the heterogeneity of itself as a field, which causes a lot of problems in terms of what kinds of coalitions we can make. Yeah, and so I think that this is a key issue. I think there has a lot of work has been done, but I think we need to do much more work on both sides of the issue.
Yeah,
and so
please go ahead.
No, I was going to build on that is that it's hard work, and there is failure that we have to also contend. So the coalitional nature is not easy, and I think Andrea, we had a mini conversation about this. Is that we find our limits, and ideally, right, we're able to do the work of empathy that is enough to cross over and build something together. But sometimes those limits can't be overcome, and so that's a difficult. So there's it's a history of both building and sometimes it's failure. And I think Anzaldúa tells us, right, that sometimes we have to take a step back, and it's necessary to regroup and protect ourselves, and then start again. That difficult work of which is spiritual for her. In a way. Anyways, I just wanted to say that it is a genuine struggle that is disciplinary, but it's also institutional. It is constant. So for me, I think I say this in an article, but it's a kind of labor and a practice, and it's difficult and painful. And but I guess conducted or guided by a vision that hopefully, right, allows us to overcome those difficulties. But Andrea, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, that was great. And I think, this is also kind of bringing to my mind this question of I think this very rich philosophical question about how do you, what holds community relations together, or a conception of subjectivity or selfhood, or even a group task or project with all of that heterogeneity, right? What is that? What makes that possible? So I think that is a huge question in so many different layers, which I know each of you have worked out, and I know I've thought about in like constantly. But I think what I also think is there's really exciting ways in which that heterogeneity, if we think with it in terms of also like the different diasporas and the different gender relations, and you mentioned too escaping violence, Cynthia, and like thinking like that too shapes our diasporas and our journeys, right? And so that to me is really important, because it also helps start to make sense of these differential relations. And I know for each of us who have have worked and lived in multiple Latinx communities, like you see that difference, and you see it in voting outcomes, and you see it in people's own responses to the pandemic, right? You see within Latin American diasporic communities, right? So it's just a fact of our communities, and it's also something that we're trying to theorize as a way of thinking about a politics that is affirming of gender difference, or a politics of thinking about sensuality in the body that lets us really understand and shape sexual futures that are fulfilling and that are not closeted, or that are not full of shame. I mean, I think, again, Anzaldua's work is a touchstone on this. But I also think, I'm really excited by some of the work by another close friend and colleague of ours, Stephanie Rivera Berrus, who's working now on thinking about ecological relations and shaping of self and identity into relations of place, right? So like, I know, Cynthia, you and I have talked about even the Gulf Coast as itself being a central site of intellectual and cultural formation for many Latinos and many Latinas and Latinx folks. So I think, that's, or the Caribbean, right, is another amazing one. The borderlands as another, right? These are hugely formative for how we negotiate our landscapes, and also how we form bonds with each other and with the non-human world. I think those are crucial. And I mean, for someone who grew up in a tourist community, like, you also see the exploitation, you also see the kind of loss of relationality, or new commodified forms of relationality to place. And I think those are the things that we're starting, I think, again, Stephanie's work and others who I'll drop. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for dropping that for Stephanie. I think folks like that are also thinking, in this really expansive, the heterogeneity is more than the human, right? The heterogeneity includes the natural worlds we're in, and the many different stories and histories that bring us to that heterogeneity.
So our second question was, I think we have already started addressing it, but which is totally fine. But I guess I'm just going to read it and to see if Andrea and Mariana have anything to add. And I know I have one thing to add. But so the second question is, what are some questions, key issues in this tradition that continue to be relevant today? And what are some future directions that you see Latinx feminisms and philosophies going towards?
I wanted to say that maybe we have,
yeah,
to make sure that we have time to deal with questions. So I just quickly will say that I think that Latina feminist philosophy needs to move in part with Latinx studies. There have been a lot of developments and changes in the US within Latinx studies, which are really showing us the need to be self-critical, a sense of a critical Latinx studies, as Poblete says, that we have to have a critical Latina feminist philosophy as well, insofar as it needs to be aware of questions about Latinas, Black Latinidad, indigeneity, issues of trans Latinidad, right? And so I think we need to be very aware of those movements within Latinx studies, so that we also keep up with the changes going on.
Andrea?
I would echo that. I mean, there's really exciting work right now by Suzy Cepeda and by Francisco Galarte and a bunch of authors who are really thinking, they're thinking from they're trying to think against the kind of colonial paradigms of gender. They're thinking against colonial paradigms of both English and Spanish as colonial languages. And so I think, you know, kind of thinking through indigeneity and relations to kind of resurgence of indigenous practices is a really exciting, you know, without the kind of romanticizing types of, you know, shopping around that people sometimes do for in terms of relations to Native politics. So I think part of that is also retaining a politics and a commitment to the presence and futurity of indigenous peoples and land rights and so on. But I also think there's really exciting work in trans studies. So not only you know, I mentioned Frank Alarte, but he's rethinking forms of masculinity, Latino and Latinx masculinity, without the kind of, you know, kind of toxic machismo attitudes that I know some of us have had plenty of contact with and are still grappling with in lots of ways. And then I think Misha Cardenas is somebody else who I think is doing really interesting work. He's a Colombian American artist and poet who's doing kind of continuing to kind of work through questions of digital identity and digital spaces and digital creation practices for Latinas, Latinx, and trans folks, and I think trans of color folks in particular. And I think that's a really, I think, an important and, you know, relevant way in which, you know, our digital lives, as we are on Zoom now, are so much of who we are and how we shape ourselves. And I think that, you know, for me, Misha Cardenas's work is really kind of embracing that and kind of doing cool poetic work that will, I think for me has been really important as well in terms of thinking about who we are in the digital realm.
I'm just going to add to, I'm going to affirm what was just said and add that an important part for me is something to tackle is what I see as an increasing authoritarianism creeping in. And also I think I'm seeing it in our own practices and like across the board. And so an authoritarianism that in the dominant culture is becoming internalized. And so kind of how do we think a check on this ourselves and our peers and our community members in you know, how do we think about this and in the challenges of the environmental problems that are coming very quickly, I think, into our community. They're there, but also like the accelerated, you know, environmental conditions that are going to demand actions and practices that it may not be, they may not allow, or it will directly challenge democratizing processes. And so how are we going to make decisions that might be emergency decisions, immediate decisions, without being authoritarian, without silencing, and without violence. So I think that's an area that we're going to have to contend with, I think, as a whole. But I'm very much interested in hoping to produce work that within Latina and Chicana and, you know, Latinx philosophy and theory to think and contend with that. So I'm going to stop there and open to the virtual public space and you know, welcome questions. Anthony, I'm going to assume that you're going to curate.
Here I am.
That's okay.
Great. Thank you so much. So actually, I think you pretty much just answered a question by Renee Ramirez, who was asking, like, who's curious about how you see the disciplines of Latinx feminisms changing. Do you have predictions or see any indications about where it may be going collectively? So Renee, I think your question's been answered, but if you have any follow-up to what was said a few minutes ago or anything else, just pop another question in the Q&A. So I'm going to turn to a question from Alice Tamimi, who asks, what might it mean to think of Gloria Anzaldúa specifically as a philosopher? What are the new kinds of questions that framing her work philosophically may generate? This brings to mind a paper by Mariana Alessandri, I think, which was framing. But anyway, another Mariana Ortega, do you have a particular response to that? I guess the question's framed around the idea that Gloria Anzaldúa has had this huge influence in other fields, but only perhaps more recently has her work begun to be thought of within a philosophical framework. So what can that do?
Yes, I think that there are philosophical views within all her writings, and it's just being discussed more as philosophy. Her work is being seen as philosophy. But it seems that one of the most important aspects in terms of philosophical thinking that comes out of her work is the question of subjectivity. And that's why I took up that question. It seems to me that she struggled with that question as many philosophers have done, right? In having to figure out not just, in philosophy, the question of personal identity is this very circumscribed question. What does it, what characteristic marks the I, so that the I can be the same self over time, this criterion. And what Anzaldúa teaches us is that that very posing of the question that there's this one criterion only should be questioned itself. And so there are a lot of questions that come up in terms of metaphysics, the metaphysics of identity, also in terms of ontology in general, right? Because in the end, a lot of Latin feminists, including Anzaldúa, in fact, Mariana Lugones gets this idea from Anzaldúa when Anzaldúa is talking about these different ways of being, different worlds. So this idea of world traveling is very much connected to the Anzaldúa notion that there are multiple worlds. So we have to think in terms of metaphysics. What does it mean to say that there are these worlds? What kind of ontologies are we assuming, or are we postulating? And so those are two. But then as Andrea and Cynthia have talked about, questions of ethics, right? And questions of relationality, right? If you have this multiplicitous complex subject, what does it mean to have relations, right? Among these multiplicitous subjects, how when there are so many differences. And so there are various questions that we have been asking and that need to be asked in the future in connection to how traditional philosophy is thinking about them and how we can rethink them if we read this literature.
Thank you. So, I'll hand it over to Andrea to follow up, but I think that also kind of perhaps touches on Lisa Crocker's question, which is there a particular subfield within philosophy to which Latina feminist philosophers tend to be situated, ethics, for example? So I don't know, maybe you want to touch a little bit on the Anzaldúa as philosopher question, and maybe also that slightly broader question about whether there are particular subfields where their work is becoming more and more prominent. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mariana just gave a really, expansive and I think also in line with my own thinking about Anzaldúa, especially as I think really undoing a kind of unified worldview. It touches everything. You have to kind of, if you're thinking, it really, it poses interesting problems, philosophical problems. And so, and I think even questions of, and these are old questions too, right? Particularity and universality, right? These are not, these are very old questions, but I think what's been really foundational for Anzaldúa, for Lugones, for Mariana's work, for Ofelia, is trying to understand also, social, Cynthia, you also mentioned social movements, right? Social movement formation is a question of also how do collectives arise, right? What unites them over time and what dissolves them, right? What things fracture them? I think those are very political questions. So it's not, you could think through many different angles on this as far as how political philosophy, phenomenology, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, right? Mariana's work in aesthetics is, I would love to hear her talk more about, because that's also, I think, aesthetics as, every movement has a music, right? Every movement has dance and creation as at the heart of it. Pain can be creative, right? Anzaldúa also discusses this. Many artists know this deeply, that there's something as devastating as trauma and violence are, many of us learn to create and learn to try to adapt and to describe and to express and as ways of healing. And I think those are things that can connect us as well as thinking about creation in the wake of violence. And I think there's an aesthetics to that. There are many Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx authors and theorists who have, been doing generations of work in, art studies, art history, and so on. And so I think we also can learn with those folks as well, and embodiment and so on. But I was thinking also, one of the things, the reason I keep dropping Mariana Alessandri's paper is because I love this line that she says in there that she says, Anzaldua was thinking, if we're thinking about whether she's a philosopher or how to read her as a philosopher, I really love Mariana Alessandri's response to this, is this idea that, Anzaldua also, considered her, wrote about herself, considered herself a philosopher in a general sense, and we were talking about this yesterday, so I hope maybe we can pick this up as well. But, some people have tried to compare her to other philosophers like Nietzsche and others and said, what is Anzaldua a philosopher like Nietzsche? And said well, should we even be asking that question? And I love that Mariana's response is actually, if you look into Anzaldua's archive, she says, we don't need to wrangle Anzaldua into standing next to Nietzsche. She goes there willingly. She's open to having her work read, or she was open to having her work read in a very philosophical register. But by philosophy, she didn't mean a very narrow, academic subfield that was only if you majored in it, only if you got a PhD in it. And so I think one of the things we were just discussing yesterday, maybe this will prompt more dialogue, was that, I think the discipline of philosophy is very different than this broader sense of being philosophical and being a philosopher as a lived practice. And I think she was thinking of philosophy as a lived practice, not in a super narrow, you have to have a PhD and you have to, I don't know, only work at a university. And so, I say that also to share for free the stuff that we get behind paywalls at universities like Mariana Alessandri's paper, because again, those are those differential access to resources and relations that are part of understanding, how people are situated, forms of injustice that keep certain forms of knowledge from folks and that don't. So I think I think there's a very philosophical way to read her, and that she is, she lives a philosophical praxis and practiced it, but I wouldn't want that to define or confine her in some way that might not be, that might not do justice to, I think, what she and others who have followed her path have done.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Cynthia, would you like to continue the rounds of this question, or take it in a new direction, pick up on something that Mariana or Andrea have said?
So I guess I will say a cautionary tale, right? And this is the idea of disciplining her, or disciplining Latina, Chicana, Latinx, Chicanx philosophy and theory. I'm concerned that we might over-philosophize, over-discipline her in philosophy and forget about that history of struggle and that, where this comes from. And so that, again, as academics, think about the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary resources that we have, and engage in communication with other academic and scholarly community, while not losing track of what's happening outside the academy. And so I think Anzaldua, one of the conversations I think she can very easily be inserted into is the distinction between ideal theory or ideal philosophy and real philosophy. I think there is sometimes a tendency in philosophy to articulate visions, or the way we would love, subjectivity to be thought, or politics to be thought, the way we would love the world to be. And Anzaldua gives us, that she invites us to imagine, to construct a vision, but it is always already very much grounded on the reality, the social, cultural, political, economic reality that situate and condition us. And so that's a difficulty. That's a philosophical, disciplinary, even for us, psychological difficulty as people in the academy. And so I think, and one more thing, because she does that, I think she makes a claim on us to think with contemporary social movements. So what thinking is arising out of social movements? I always think about theory and philosophy and ideas that are coming out of the social, and new ideas and new philosophical contribution coming out of that change, right? That we ourselves or people out there putting their bodies on the line provoke, right? And so there's also, that's a futuristic aspect of thinking that so I don't know if I'm adding to how she fits in philosophy, but rather I'm concerned with disciplining her into an academic field and therefore losing the history of her contributions, but also like other Chicana Latinx thinkers. So I'll stop there.
That's awesome. So we're pretty much at time. I suppose the nature of a round table means that, you know, we can only ask a few questions, which is absolutely, you know, the way it should be. I mean, I guess I was thinking we could just finish the event if any of you have any sort of final words, either reflecting on things that have been spoken about or maybe touching on a couple of things that haven't been spoken about. So Mariana, do you have any final thoughts or reflections?
I want to concur with what Cynthia has said, that in taking up, and especially I urge those of you who are in the event to go and look at this text. I think, as I said, they are a little bit disorienting and reorienting in very wonderful ways. And I think I encourage you to visit these texts and see how you can connect your own philosophical thinking with them, but also to be careful not to try to encase these texts within the philosophies that we know, because precisely their beauty is the way that they can make us rethink philosophy as we understand it now.
Thank you. That's a beautiful thought. Just on that particular topic, especially for those in the event who maybe don't know anything about the field, or people who are going to watch the future recording, do you have a couple of good starting points? Because if some of these authors can be quite disorientating, there may be a particular book or paper that may be a little bit more of a gateway into their thinking.
Oh, I would have them read Anzaldúa, Borderlands for sure, but a shorter paper would be Norma Alarcón, The Subjects of This Bridge Called My Back, would be a very good starting point, because Andrea talked about the 1987 anthology, This Bridge Called My Back, and I think that that's where a lot of people start in feminism, at least in the US, for women of color feminism. But what Norma Alarcón does is to tease out some philosophical important points about what these authors are doing in their numerous media, poetry, stories, descriptions of lived experience. And so Norma Alarcón does a very interesting job showing the importance of the anthology for philosophical reasons. Yeah. That would be mine. I don't know what you two want to suggest.
Perfect.
I think I would. This Bridge Called My Back, I think, is a great anthology in general, and that's where you're going to find that essay. I mean, it's complex, eye-opening, produces a remolino in our thinking, but it's also very accessible. It's not an academic text, and I think that's what's incredibly beautiful about it. So I'll just stop there. There's more modern stuff, but I'm just gonna say.
I would also give a plug for anyone. I'm not a parent myself, but anybody that has children. I also think Anzaldua, I mean, I know she did. She wrote 2 children's books. And I think those are also really cool entry points to not only do philosophy as an adult, but also with your kids. And so, exactly, there we go. So Cynthia's holding them up here. Amigos del Otro Lado and Prietita and the Ghost Woman. And they're both bilingual books. So they both have English and Spanish. They're beautiful stories of connection, and they have ecological stuff going on. They have friendship stuff and ethics going on. They have embodiment stuff, and it's welcoming. I think it's like age range is 6 to 10, I think is around the age range that they're for. And so, yeah, if you, again, pushing back against the constraints of the academe, like kids are great philosophers. And so, you know, getting them excited and also learning about difference and learning about, you know, human complexity and human, non-human world relations and all that kind of stuff. So I would definitely say that if you want to do something, you know, try to work through a fun philosophical books with your kids, those would be 2 sources to recommend.